Good evening, everybody. Sorry, I'm surprised, everybody. I'm not Bill, obviously. Bill's having a technical issue, and he was very late in the evening to figure it out, or his computer really gave him some fairly serious fits like 10 minutes ago. So, at last minute. But we wanted to go live and have a conversation with Dave. I was looking forward to watching this show myself. Uh, Dave, I haven't mentioned before, I'm Andy. I went to do a lot of the IT side of this stuff.
Okay.
For gentlemen, it's a pleasure to meet you. I don't know much about your layout, but Johnny just called me briefly. And he did say you were a prior Air Force.
Yes.
I just done a 4-year term, so I can't call. I mean, I was a flyboy, but many years ago, and I didn't put a lot of time in. But a fellow Air Force fella, and he said you're HO and HO3. I'm really interested in the narrow gauge stuff too. So why don't you give us a 10,000 foot view or something of your layout? What are you capturing?
Okay, so I do both HO, N3, and N scale. Not on the same layout, obviously, but right now behind me is my 12-foot by 14-foot HON3 Rio Grande Southern 1st District. So it represents the RGS in the time period from about 1938 to about 1947, although I have some stuff that I'll stretch the era. I've got like a diamond stack engine and some Silverton short line stuff that's obviously a little anachronistic for that era for the RGS, but it's all, it's mostly Blackstone stuff, basically, I had been into narrow gauge sort of as a side interest for a long time. And then moving here to Colorado with the Air Force in 2013, I kind of got bitten by the bug again to the point where I couldn't fight it. And thankfully, Blackstone was still available at reasonable prices about then. So I made the switch from modeling the Pennsylvania Railroad and N scale to modeling the Rio Grande Southern and HON3.
Wonderful. And the Blackstone stuff has got really hard to come by. I've paid attention to it for years. I model Class 1 main lines too. I model Norfolk and Western, so pretty similar to your Pensy stuff. I mean, especially back in the 50s, they were the same pair of companies. So they were ran very similar anyway. But I've had that narrow gauge bug for a long time too. And that those war years are spectacular, especially for the narrow gauge stuff. I've been fascinated by a bunch of those. So you still have the N gauge or N scale. I hate when people do that most of the time. N scale project and layout, and then the HON3 behind you. Are you into the operations side of it, or is it largely a modeling and building? Are you a builder or an operator?
I am most definitely a builder. So you may see if I pan around a little bit, I've got some car cards and waybills and so on. Frankly, those haven't really moved out of the box for maybe about 3 years now. So I just have a habit of putting together a consist that looks good, several consists, and just running them around. Now, I'm modeling a railroad that only ran, its daily train was the Galloping Goose. You're probably familiar with that, the rail bus. And it might have run a steam freight maybe once every couple of days or so. Meanwhile, I've got 2 trains on the main right now. I would have 3, except when I'm doing a show like this, I've noticed if I have more than 2, I'm spending all my time looking over my shoulder, trying to make sure I'm not running trains into one another rather than paying attention to the screen. You mentioned wartime, and one of the things that interests me about the Rio Grande Southern, and when you kind of do the research, is during the war, the government actually owned the RGS. There was a representative from Rico, Colorado, who actually a lady named Betty Pellet. She went to Washington to lobby to get the RGS purchased by the government because of its necessity for the war effort. And so during the era that I modeled, for at least part of it, it was owned by the Defense Supplies Corporation, which was a subsidiary of the government, and leased back to the operators. And so you'll see sometimes in some of my equipment, little teeny tiny stencil that says, property of Defense Supplies Corporation, owner and lessor.
Wow. But I've seen another modeler that I've seen that modeled the RGS had, for that same time period, had a facility on his layout where they had to drop the cars outside of the facility, and the government took them into the facility because they made some kind of some unusual product nobody knew about that we would hear about in late 45.
Right.
Yeah. However, it's so interesting, and I didn't know that about the government control, whereas World War I, they did nationalize. In World War II, all the railroads fought that, but the RGS fought for that, I suppose.
Right, because it was really their only chance at salvation. And by doing so, they were forgiven for, years of back taxes and debt to the various counties the railroad ran through. But really, the purchase by the government was really just a loan. And so when the 2 different government sort of Defense Supplies Corporation loans came due, and the railroad just couldn't pay them back, and it staggered on till the end of 1951, and that was that. I do have an ore loader kind of over my shoulder that was part of the process for the what they called yellow cake, which was uranium ore. And parked next to it is an Army Jeep with World War II Army markings on it. I didn't have room for the big. I know who you're talking about. I think you're talking about Bill Scobie. I didn't have room for his gigantic vanadium mill. He's got an amazing layout. He's been an amazing inspiration to my work. But I just have this little space to work with. This basement has a number of purposes, the railroad only being one of them. We've got, the entertainment area, the bar, and so on, and our home gym. So I confined myself to this little 12 by 14 foot alcove, which actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise because I was able to actually finish the layout in a pretty short period of time. Right after I retired from the Air Force, I spent about a year out of the workforce, and I kind of put myself into full-time layout work. And it really took maybe about 18 months to get this to the point where I was able to publish my first article on this layout in HO3 Annual. So,
wow, 18 months. That upsets my feelings. Mine's ever so slightly larger, but not much. I mean, it's 15 by 15. There's a few square feet difference. There's not much difference, and I'm 6 years on it. I have some scenery, I have some trees, I have track laid, but it's a 2-deck job, and it feels like I bit off a little more than I could chew. I mean, I'll get there, but but I'm also working full time. I'd love to be able to work on the layout 40 hours or something. I'd like to have 40 hours in a month to work on the layout. It would feel pretty good for me, but that's an amazing level of completion. 18 months is astonishing. When 5 years would be relatively impressive by most people I know standards, and the scenery is really quite spectacular that I can see.
Well, thanks.
So what you're building, give us some of the what do they call those? The track details or the layout details that you see on any of the track plans in MR, MR8 in the magazine. So
sure.
What type of track, grades, curve, radii?
Yep, sure, absolutely. So the layout itself is about 12 by 14 feet. The track is commercial code 70. There's maybe a few pieces of hand-laid track. The trestle decks are all hand-laid for obvious reasons. And then there's 2 turnouts that are hand-laid, one curved and one 3-way stub, because they're just not available commercially. But everything else is either micro-engineering, Pico, or Shinohara Code 70 Flex Track. I'm not really good at track work, but I also kind of have a philosophy that bulletproof track work is a sort of a critical component. You'll notice the trains are just kind of running. I've been running them for about 45 minutes now. Now that I mentioned it, I probably will have a derailment or a stall. But generally speaking, this state layout can kind of do its own thing for hours on end, mainly because, I realized that my skill at handling more appropriate, say, code 40 track just wasn't going to be there. And so I'm willing to compromise a little on the appearance to make the track much more bulletproof. And of course, all the frogs are powered. I drop feeders about every 3 feet. I have this thing soldered, 6 ways from Tuesday. I did actually just in the most recent issue of H13 Annual, so I've got cover shots taken right over my shoulder here, did an article on how to actually paint and detail Code 70 commercial track work to make it look a little bit more realistic. In terms of minimum radius, I have an 18-inch coming off of Bridge 45A at Ophir, and if you're a Rio Grande Southern fan, you know what I'm talking about, that tight curve around Ophir Loop. And then the rest of it's pretty much between 19 and 21 inches. Minimum turnout is number 4 in the Rico yard. Well, I guess really the curved turnout coming off of 45A at Ophir is really my minimum. It's got a 16-inch inner radius, but I can actually move a Blackstone K27 through that 16-inch radius curve if I go slowly, but I actually tend to switch that with idlers the way the RGS did. Let's see, it is digital command control. I use Digitrax. You may see over my shoulder the familiar LocoNet panels. I'm still tethered in like the Stone Age, but mainly because it's mostly just me, and because it's a cockpit layout, it's very easy just to move around and plug in as I go. I haven't really felt the need to go radio yet. That may happen. It is a single level layout. There's no grades. It's all flat. I try to give the appearance of grades simply by having the scenery vary at different levels above and below the floor. So you can see, it really doesn't have any grades, but it looks like it might. And it is a cockpit design. I have a lift out bridge that's over in that direction there. And that I use for, I'm sorry, am I sharing here? What just happened? I lost the inner screen showing you.
Yeah, that's okay. You were showing the layout. I wanted to see that and let everybody see it as big as I could, especially along the trestle there, which that's what I love. My favorite section of the RGS that I've seen, and Bill Scobie, as you mentioned, he's one of my top 5 favorite layouts in the world.
Oh, yeah.
And it's narrow gauge, where I'm class 1, and all my other favorites tend to be class 1, but his layout is so exceptional that it has made me more and more interested in narrow gauge single-handedly by his layout. I mean, there's a few others that are really quite exceptional, Lex Parker, who's tearing his down right now, and I'm disappointed about. But
I know, I heard about that. Yeah, he's moving apparently.
Absolutely. And seeing the Facebook pictures of that layout, which is one of the most superb layouts, it's in a short list of great layouts of all time, probably his level of modeling and craftsmanship. I'll definitely have to get a copy of the annual. I hand lay track as well. The biggest reason, or on all my layout, the biggest reason I hand lay is the natural wood ties, because I'm not an artist. I'm an engineer in every way. Laying track doesn't scare me at all, but the scenery, which I have done quite a bit of, I still don't feel incredibly competent at. That's something that I'm not an artist. I'm definitely an engineer. So seeing the level of artistry that you have, and all the track you're talking about, microengineering, et cetera, are all pretty exceptional products by anything we had, 30 years ago. So,
no doubt. And I have to throw out props to Pico for entering the HON3 field. Their number 5 Unifrog turnouts are amazing. So I think, I could be wrong on this, but I think the Unifrog first appeared on the HON3 switch that they did. It's a very, very short frog that you can either treat as an insulated frog, or it comes already with a small phosphor bronze wire solder to it. So I use all the Tam Valley frog juicers. So all my frogs are powered, and I don't have to think about it, right? But those turnouts are very well designed. They have very strong internal centering springs. And so since the RGS was a very manual layout, or railroad, they operated, their last year in 1951, it was still operated like it was 1890. I hand throw all my turnouts. I don't have any remote, switches, and I don't have any decoders that turn the turnouts or anything. The only thing I have that's controlled remotely like that is I threw an old N-scale diesel decoder into my turntable at Ridgeway, so I can control it that way. But otherwise, I do it all, bending the iron the way, a railroader and the RGS might.
Absolutely. Well, but that gives you that opportunity to run trades or operate. I love the up close and personal of the manual operation, especially on the narrow gauge that had, the thing you mentioned, that they were always in receivership and that level of things. That's what the most people are attracted to the narrow gauge railroads for, especially in that time period, because they were shoestring operations. Everything was beat to death all the time. I really love capturing that. If you've been able to get your track work to that level, it will surely work incredibly reliably. So were you a modeler? Not to get some of the cliche answers, but I'm assuming you were a modeler as a young fella, and then during the military time had to take the break that becomes necessary.
So
all the way through?
I dabbled. I got my first HO train set at age 8. My father was a model railroader. He got me into the hobby, and he got his start when he was a Boy Scout back in the 50s, back when Boys Life magazine had a column on model railroading. And when I was, obviously I had a break when I was in college. Neither had the time nor, did I really, I was interested in other things. But right after I got commissioned in the Air Force, I immediately started on an HO layout, then got orders to Korea, so it went to the dumpster. Started on another one when I got back to the States, and so on. And eventually I moved to N-scale. I had started in HO because that was what my dad did. And then the N-scale Pennsylvania Railroad, which you guys might remember. I don't know if you've, so it was in Great Model Railroads 2014. That layout was designed on a hollow core door, and that thing came with me on several assignments. And it actually followed me here to our retirement home here in, that sounds terrible, the house we retired to in Colorado Springs. And I actually sold it to a good friend of mine who lives in California, who's originally from Delaware, grew up on the Pennsy, big Pennsy fan. So I know that layout is in great shape. It's being well cared for, but got bitten hard by the narrow gauge bug, and so this is it. So I've been modeling most of my life with mainly just a break in college and then a break. Even when I was stationed in Korea, I had a little workshop where I was working on kits and so on.
Yes.
Deployments, obviously, I didn't take anything with me, but I know guys who did actually, and I kind of regret that I didn't.
I wasn't in that long, but I tried. I tried modeling, and I also switched to N-scale while I was in the military, tried to do a little switching layout or what have you. It wasn't as comfortable for me, but I didn't have as long a tenure in to have to worry about that. But I didn't know many people who did more than build kits. I did know a few people who built kits and put them in boxes, but that stuff, it doesn't travel very well for the military. That's why so many people kind of take a break and come back to it. I just came back earlier than I expected when I got back to the hospital around 40. I expected I'd probably do it later.
Well, the N-scale Pensy actually I built a pretty substantial plywood furniture crate that went over it, that the layout was actually integral to. And we, on several occasions, on several PCSs, we actually let the government contract movers move the layout for me, which was a bit of a leap of faith. But one time I did rent a U-Haul trailer and threw it in the back myself, and it ended up basically in the same shape it would have had the government movers moved it. I think I had a couple trees dislodged on one move, and that was about it. It actually... The layouts I build tend to be about 60 to 70% glue, so that probably helps. But generally speaking, it traveled way better than you might think, and I was able to really participate in the hobby, even though I was moving around in some cases in as little as 2 years. But the flip side of that, of course, is that I was always constrained to, something the size of a hollow core door, something that could fit in any conceivable extra room I might have at whatever duty assignment I ended up with. And I spent a lot of time stationed in the South where basements just aren't a thing. So it had to be able to fit in a spare bedroom.
Yeah. And I remember that layout. I knew I recognized your name from somewhere. I couldn't put it together. I remember double track main line, little bridge on one side with the road that shot up under, a little city scene along the center.
One. And I take zero credit for that design because that was 100% Lou Sassy and that project railroad he did for MR back in '93. All I did was change the locale by one state and change the railroad from Conrail to Pensy. And ironically, I ended up modeling Conrail and Penn Central anyway. So
yeah. Oh, Lou, it's hard to argue with any of Lou Sassy's work. I mean, I've followed my railroader all the many years, and Lou Sassy was my favorite for a long time. I use his he called it ground goop material as my scenic medium from Lou Sassy. The tree methodology, I built quite a few of the trees with some of the techniques that he used. What a spectacular one. But boy, you done a spectacular job on that, on the N-scale layout that I remember that so exquisitely to every detail. That was a spectacular layout for a long time.
Thank you. Well, in N-scale these days, I'm doing the Colorado Midland. So it's definitely a different thing. So instead of a class 1 at the transition era, it's 1905 in the Colorado High Country.
Wow.
So
1905, that's fascinating. And being able to get the equipment for that early era.
It's a bit of a challenge. Now, I have Facebook pages for both of my projects. There's one for the HON3 RGS and one for the Colorado Midland. Now, the Colorado Midland is in the other room, but what I could do is if you wanted me to share, I could actually share some photos off the Midland Facebook page, and you can have a look at what it looks like.
Absolutely. Well, I'd really love to see what it looks like now, especially, or of course, and especially to anybody who is not familiar with this layout, that it was really something, that little Pensy layout. The size cannot be the good argument for why not to build space.
Agreed. All right, let me do a little driving here. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Don't share the tips again. Okay, I'm going to share the entire screen because we tested this with Bill, and this ends up being essentially the easiest way to do it. So hopefully you are now seeing my screen. So here's the Colorado Midland Railroad.
I don't have it yet. Why don't I have your screen share yet?
You don't have me?
No, not yet. Normally,
okay, let me try again. Let's see. Chrome has lost permission to capture your entire screen. Oh boy. All right. That's interesting. All right. Is this article helpful? No.
Well, you may just have to try it again, and it should pop up a little thing that lets you.
Yeah, let me try it again because we did test this with Bill. I promise I was present for the tech shakedown.
Sure. There's no problem.
Okay. All right. Let's try this again. I could try either. No, Chrome has lost position. Let me try one other thing here. This was supposed to be a little easier than it is. Let's see.
Well, you may even just have to. There'll be a little icon in the address bar up at the top. There'll be a little thing where you can reapply the permissions if it doesn't ask you, or there may be. Let's say.
All right. Give me one quick second here. It says modify. I got to go to security and privacy for on my Mac because Mac decided. I bet I got some kind of change pushed, probably in the last update between here and then. Let's see. Security. I will say general. Let's see.
And I'm getting caught up in the chat with you guys, and I may have been behind. Hello, everybody. Yeah, to any of the latecomers, I'm definitely not Bill. He's having a little bit of technical difficulty tonight, so I'm talking to Mr. David Vollmer, who I knew I recognized his name from seeing his work many years ago, but just couldn't put the two and two together as quickly.
Yeah, it shows my browser is checked. That's interesting. That's really weird. I should be able. Oh, screen recording. Yeah, that's what I checked.
Yeah, that's all Windows requires.
Yeah, I'm on Mac, and usually Mac is not. Well, I shouldn't say that.
But I'm an Apple guy too. They do tend to be pretty security sensitive, and it may be required that you restart Chrome. Yeah. Well, we'll have him back in just a second. Right. Yeah, thanks, Heath. I was thinking he may have to go through that too. On a Macintosh, it's not normally as bad to have to restart it, but there's a plugin, of course, that does the screen sharing. That may be required, and it is likely that it would require Chrome to restart that plugin. I think I've been able to do that manually, but what is JFRTM SJC? Acronyms. I know I remember that. I remember all the acronyms for military, but ECAPUS, I suppose I don't know that acronym. All right.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Let's see if that might have made the difference. Then again, it might not have. Let's try it again. Sorry. Share screen, and let's see if it's going to be persnickety again. Nope, that's weird. I followed the right steps to make this work, and it's not working. So let me see if I can try to do a Chrome tab.
There we go.
All right. Hey, that worked. It didn't work last time, but now it worked. All right, great. So this is the Facebook page for my N-Scale Colorado Midland. So you can see this is some of the work that I've been doing in N. Kind of more of a fantasy layout. This is kind of scratching my Wild West itch. It represents some of the common practices on the Colorado Midland, but it's not really a dedicated model of any particular scene or anything else in particular. As you noted rightly, it's more than a little difficult to get period equipment for this era in N scale. You can see I have at least a dozen or half a dozen of these Athearn MDC 280s. Got a couple of the Bachmann 10-wheelers that I've backdated and so on. I also had some custom decals shot for the Colorado Midland, and there's a company called K4 Decals that you can find on eBay that also has quite a few Colorado Midland decals, along with decals for other railroads that the Midland connected with, like the Midland Terminal, the Colorado Springs and Cripple Creek District Railroad, and some other very obscure lines that you probably never heard of. So just sort of some more shots here. This is 2.5 feet by 5 feet. The track is Pico Code 55. And I use that same painting technique for the N-scale track here as I do my narrow gauge HON3 track. And you can see a lot of these Wild West scale model builders kits. Love those kits. They're not for the faint of heart. Like each of these windows is, between 8 and 10 individual pieces and so on. They're kind of delicate, but they're so well engineered and so well designed that if you take your time, they go together like a dream. And they really look like nothing else on the market. So just kind of some more shots of, the scene here at Basalt, which is near Aspen. And then this is Aspen itself. And so on. So just here's an overall view of the layout. So you can see it's pretty small. It's portable, so it has telescoping legs, just like the old Pensy layout did. It can be carried by 2 people up the stairs and out to train shows. So most of the scenery is extruded styrofoam and so on. So, and then in terms of the other place we can go, let me hit Facebook real quick, and we will go to HON3 First District, Rio Grande Southern. So you can see here's a shot on Bridge 45A on the part of the layout you can't really see from the perspective that my camera's sitting. But if you wanted to visit that too, here's my Ridgeway Roundhouse with some eclectic motive power here. For what it's worth, I have a thing for the San Juan Central. I don't know if I'm going to go ahead and stop the sharing here. I don't know if you guys recall the articles back in the early 80s that Malcolm Furlow did for Model Railroader magazine, but the San Juan Central was a huge influence on my work. And, there was a period of time where I thought everything Malcolm Furlow did was the most amazing stuff ever. And then years later, I had a period of time where I thought his stuff was just kind of comical and not very realistic. And I've kind of come full circle on that because I really began to realize what he was doing and more of a three-dimensional art piece meant to evoke a mood. And he was so wildly successful at that. I've decided that I've got a whole fleet. I'm going to kind of lean over here, grab some. I've built a whole fleet of San Juan Central equipment, just kind of as a sort of a homage. Yes, that's the word exactly. An homage. Even one of my Blackstone engines got some San Juan Central decals on it. So I got a fleet of boxcars and some other stuff lettered for the SJC. So anytime I do something that's freelanced in HON3, I just slap some San Juan Central decals on it, and now it's good to go, right? So I don't have to worry I can be a total prototype snob, or I can just have fun with it.
But I grew up with that he was an influential modeler in my time too. He was at the time in my young life an inspiration along the likes of John Allen. Had that comical. He was the late 70s, 80s, 90s version of that. I do know someone. I worked at a hobby shop when I was quite young before I enlisted, and I known someone who had seen his layout. And I think they'd even seen maybe the San Juan, or it might have been one of his other layouts. And it was built with pallets that he had took apart. He said he had like $1.25 worth of screws in the entire framework of the layout.
Yeah, I've heard that.
He was talking about it.
I've heard that.
And I had one of his VHS at the time. I'm quite sure it might have been Betamax, but no, it was VHS tapes of the layout that he had built like into a. It's like, and you could just walk into the room. It was a room maybe the size of your room that you could just step inside of, and the layout wrapped entirely around you. But boy, I had the same kind of effect. I had started to take myself fairly seriously and started to his stuff kind of annoyed me as well. But I've started to really see the comic value in it that I'd lost some appreciation for when I was taking myself a little too seriously for a while. I could see that circle.
Same here. I mean, and I began to realize too, no scene on the San Juan Central or his Denver and Rio Chama Western was a match for any particular scene that you might see here in Colorado. But as soon as you looked at it, you knew without a shadow of a doubt that you were looking at Colorado narrow gauge. And that was to be able to pull that off with the vertical drama that he did. His was really into his rust and weathering techniques. And I remember having the VHS cassette tape that I remember they used to cost like $70 if you got them from Kalmbach, but on weathering with Malcolm Furlow. And I was a young, impressionable kid at the time, and I smashed the heck out of a lot of stuff and destroyed a lot of stuff trying to mimic his techniques. But, in retrospect, I didn't have the same vision he had. And so I was never going to be successful at doing what he was doing just by trying to willy-nilly apply his techniques without context. But in terms of trying to evoke that, you're definitely in the Colorado high country feel. He would get away with putting cactus. Cactus doesn't grow. I mean, saguaro cactus doesn't even grow in this state, but he could do that. And you still felt like you were looking at Colorado narrow gauge, right? And just, the trees, he did a really good job with the actual scenery itself. I mean, it was probably even more exaggerated than you might find anywhere outside of maybe the Animas River Gorge here, or the Royal Gorge or the Black Canyon. But it just looks so real. And he was always really good at photographing it and lighting it and stuff like that. So one of the ways he's inspired me is I kind of built the layout in a way where I know where all the good camera angles are. And so when I share pictures of the layout, it's such a great layout. It's like, well, that's only because I'm letting you see what I want you to see. You don't see all the blemishes. You don't see all the view angles that don't work well. And that was kind of how his philosophy was, because I've known people who have seen, because the San Juan Central is now in a museum in California. Yeah. And there are some places that are kind of rough where he really didn't spend a lot of time, and they were transition scenes that he never intended to photograph. So yeah, I took a lot of inspiration from the San Juan Central, and there's times, I love miring myself in the research on the real Rio Grande Southern, and finding out what date such and such a car was scrapped, and what trains were moved on what day, and so on. But there's times where I kind of wish I'd done what he did and just freelanced it and just had fun with it.
And I'm torn myself in both directions. I am a prototype modeler. I mean, there's no such thing as 100% prototype. We all make some
Right.
sacrifices.
Oh yeah.
He did what Walt Disney did. He had that. There's an effect that's almost like what a person thinks Colorado looks like when they've never seen it before. But for
Right.
sure, it looks like Colorado, but it's cinematic in a way that is not what a person who has visited Colorado knows it looks like. Us more prototype people, tend to go down the rabbit hole of seeing only what's there when we visited exactly what's there, not what's in this imagination. As an engineer and a prototype modeler, I really suffer from lack of that artistic vision. But you've got some pretty dramatic scenery that you've been able to pull off behind you. He had done stuff that was floor to ceiling that was that was thousands of feet of elevation in prototype.
Well, this was kind of my homage to the San Juan Central, where we had the rock overhanging the benchwork. So I did that here at Windy Point, just kind of as a shout out. I actually reached out to Malcolm a couple years ago, just to kind of thank him for his inspiration and share a couple pictures of my own San Juan Central stuff. He's a real down to earth guy, real nice guy. And he intimated to me that one of his family members, I think he said his grandfather, or his great grandfather or great uncle or somebody, actually worked as a conductor briefly for the Rio Grande Southern. And so that's kind of his connection to the RGS. Now, having been out to RGS country, and I live here in Colorado, but I don't live on the western slope. I did take an excursion out there the week I retired from the Air Force. I did my final out. My parents had come out for my retirement, and I took my dad, who it got me in not only into model railroading, but specifically into the RGS, because he had a bunch of books. He was a big Lucius Beebe fan. So if you know who that is, and his books on the narrow gauge and so on. So I took him out there with my big stack of books and maps and so on, and we traced the Rio Grande Southern, and we drove on the grade where we were allowed to, obviously. And we found artifacts like a piece of trim from the old Rico Depot, a brick from the Rico engine house, lumps of coal from the Ridgeway yard, and so on. And my father just ate that up. He still talks about it. Yeah, he's starting to unfortunately have some memory issues, but he remembers that trip like it was yesterday. But one thing that really struck me, oh, by the way, that's where I got all the dirt for the layout, by the way. If you wonder why the dirt matches the backdrop so well, it's just because it has to. It's the real dirt, right?
It's the dirt the picture is taken of.
Exactly. So it's not any skill on my part. It's automatically what happened. But anyway, what I was getting at was, when you're touring the RGS, you tend to think, oh, big vertical rock walls and trestles. And yes, the RGS had that. But they also had many, many miles of just a flat track running through open pasture land or up in high mountain parks where the mountains are miles away. And it was also, I was there in September, which is the month I model. I think most narrow gaugers model September because of the stock extras that you can run. And I've got a stock train parked at Placerville that is going to go out on the main after we're done here. But it's much greener than most modelers. Most modelers they go for the browns. But Colorado in September, the high country is extremely green. So you'll see my layout is a little bit greener than you might expect. And I kind of went into that in the first article I wrote for HON3 Annual about that. But it's one of those things where physically being there in the space, I got a very different impression that if I only knew about this from what other modelers did.
Yeah.
So I'm going to shout out, I think he's watching, my friend Ed Kapuscinski, who's a Conrail modeler, N-scale guy. A lot of you guys probably know who this guy is. But he has pointed out to me that a lot of times as model railroaders, we have a habit of modeling what other people have modeled. We think we're modeling a prototype, but we were always inspired by someone else's work, right? And so some of their impressions sort of seep into our impression. It's like watching a movie based on a book. So I tried to kind of put that out of my mind. As much as I love the San Juan Central, puts that out of my mind and just go from photographs, go from my personal experience, go from the books, and model that as if I'd never seen anyone else do the RGS. And so if mine looks a little different, it might be because I kind of tried to push away some of the typical tropes that we have with Colorado narrow gauge, like having to have tunnels. The RGS never had a tunnel, right? Or having to have big steel bridges because Malcolm Furlow had one. The RGS didn't have any steel bridges with the exception of the truss bridge leading into Durango, and that actually belonged to the Denver and Rio Grande. So, things like that I had to kind of just, set all of that aside and say, if I had never seen another model railroad, how would I model this?
Yeah.
So in some respects, it doesn't look like everybody's RGS, and that may not be good. That may actually not be good, because there's a lot of much better work out there than what I've done. But in some respects, I think, I try to be true to my own impression of physically being out in the space. And like, for example, that picture of Lizard Head, by the way, that slab of masonite is going to be replaced with one that covers the whole window. But that picture of Lizard Head is one I took. My dad and I hiked out to a point where William Henry Jackson had taken a photograph in 1891. And my father had painted that. He was an artist too. And he had painted that for a Christmas card, I think the year he and my mother got married, so about 1962. And I promised him we would find that spot, and we did. And I took that picture of Lizard Head Peak, which looks a little different now because sometime in the 20th century, part of the peak collapsed under just a landslide. But we were able to stand there right where William Henry Jackson had taken that photograph that my father had painted so many decades previous. And that was a special experience for him. So, he and I have shared this hobby throughout our entire relationship together. And so to get to experience the real RGS, even though it wasn't really there, but it was there in some ways. We could stand on the grade and see the old ties buried in the mud, or, we could see Trout Lake Trestle is still there. Water tanks in some places are still there, and really get a feel for what it must have been like. And you know what? As impressive as it is in the books, it is so much more impressive when you stand in that rugged country and you think that guy Otto Mears and his chief engineer Wigglesworth somehow found a way to lay a railroad through that terrain. I mean, you look at these rock walls and you look at some of this terrain, you go, no way. These guys said, not only are we going to do it, we're going to do it in a year and a half. And they did it.
Man, there was some tougher men in those days, that level of toughness, they could do some of the engineering and accomplish, and, suboptimal. I've been to Colorado several times. I love it. It's one of the most beautiful states I've ever visited. Yeah. And I have drove from Denver over to Grand Junction. It's 4.5, 5 hours across through there. That mountain, building a highway across that mountain with an automobile that can handle 10 and 12% grades, it's a little daunting. Let alone built a railroad through parts of that is really, it's really incredible. But I had not put the two together, and there's, until the things you're saying right now about other modelers, the messenger or whatever that old game we played in grade school where you tell somebody something.
Telephone. Yep.
That's what's happening with our modeling, with our prototype, is there's this telephone effect that's losing fidelity as we go. But focusing on the prototype is what's giving you the colors that obviously looked right to me from the time that from the few times I've been to Colorado. The color behind your shoulder is spectacularly what I remember there. And every modeler I've ever seen has not done that justice.
It is. I mean, even here on the Front Range, which is drier than the San Juans, during the monsoon season, we do have a monsoon, believe it or not. And I'm a meteorologist, so I actually teach this stuff. But the North American monsoon happens here in Colorado starting typically late June and sometimes continues into early September. And so even here on the Front Range, where we have cactus and yucca plants that grow in the wild, it gets green. I mean, our Front Range sometimes looks like Austria. It's so green. And you forget that, out on the western slope in the San Juans, it gets even greener than that time of year. It's definitely very, very brown in the mud season and, certainly in the autumn. But, and there's that sort of spectacular 2-week autumn that we have out here. Typically, if you start seeing the aspen start to change, you've got about a week to go see them. It's not like back east. I grew up in the Northeast and went to school at Penn State. And I remember autumn being several months long. Here, it's a 2-week flash in the pan. I mean, shoot, here in Colorado Springs, not this past September, but the September previous, we had half a foot of snow on September 8th. So the winter comes fast. So I'm trying to kind of capture a little of that there's some snow in the high peaks on the backdrop, but we're right when the aspen are at peak at the higher elevation. So that's the other thing I did to try to give the impression of some elevation. Ridgeway is very green, like it's still summer. But when I get up to Lizard Head, it's past peak. The trees, they're all the color just remains in sort of the yellow weeds and the conifers there. Any aspen would have dropped their leaves. In fact, it's too high for aspen at that point anyway. So you kind of have this impression of elevation based on how much drier and more dormant the vegetation looks.
Yeah,
And again, that's based on photos that I took in one day in the same week that I modeled.
that makes a lot of sense. And people who happen to be familiar with Colorado may not even realize the thing that you've done, but it has a subconscious subliminal effect on a person. Those colors and such do as well. Although I don't think we have very long autumns or falls here anymore either. We have a week or two. It's summer. It threatens us with winter, and then winter's here. That may just be a sign of the times, but.
But my layout representing the first district of the RGS varies in elevation from 7,000 feet at Ridgeway, the low point on the northern end, to about 10,250 at Lizard Head Peak. So Lizard Head, that's at 2 miles above sea level, gets, I think I read somewhere around 350 to 400 inches of snow per year. At one point, they measured 208 inches on the ground during the past. It doesn't get as much snow now, but and unfortunately, that's part of why we have the water problems downstream. The last 20 years, we haven't gotten enough snow out here. But, there was enough, I guess, a couple of years ago for the Cummers and Toltec to run their rotary. So that was kind of fun. I do try to keep up with the narrow gauge scene out here. I'm a volunteer at the Colorado Rare Museum, although I don't get up there nearly as often as I should to help out. We have all the great stuff here, the Durango and Silverton, Cummers and Toltec, the Georgetown Loop, Colorado Rare Museum itself. We are having the narrow gauge convention here in Denver in 2023, and tentatively I am on the tour schedule. So if you find yourself really wanting to scratch the narrow gauge itch and coming out to Denver, I really can't think of a better place to have one, although I'm hoping soon with the East Broadtop being resurrected that maybe they'll have one out by Altoona someday. But for now, come on out next year to Denver and you get to see this layout in person. They'll be busing folks down here. And I guess I've been told they want me to do a clinic. I don't know what I'll do the clinic on. I haven't been given a topic yet. I don't know if it's going to be scenery or what, or maybe just, how to photograph crappy modeling to make it look better. I don't know. Something along that line.
Oh, the prototype would be incredible. And for anybody who may consider going to Colorado, any chance you get to go to Colorado is worth it, in my experience.
Oh, yeah.
And even if you're not a narrow gauge modeler, if you appreciate high quality modeling, some of the best modeling that is done, bar none, is done in the narrow gauge convention group of folks.
Oh, yeah. I agree. In fact, I think the Front Range is just a magnet for really good modeling. I used to be an old lone wolf. I really had never come across a club I would ever really consider joining because I didn't really find a group of guys that had similar interests to me. But here I belong to the modular club called Slim Rail. We have an HON3 layout and an ON3 layout. And these guys model circles around me. I feel like, the little kid brother that gets to tag along with the cool kids every time these guys show off their models because they are phenomenal modelers. And I've learned so much from them. And again, it's focused on narrow gauge because I think narrow gauge, it's just a little bit with the exception of Blackstone, which that's not really a thing anymore. But you really couldn't just open a box and have narrow gauge fall out. The way you have that option in HON, so you can choose to be a true craftsman, or you can choose to be sort of a ready to run kind of thing. N scale too is kind of similar to that, where you can do like the T track with the Cato Unitrack, and that's some great stuff. And I've seen some amazing things, really realistic stuff done with that. Sure. But to be a narrow gauger, you kind of have to not be afraid of craftsman kits and not be afraid to build a locomotive and work with brass. And so maybe that's why there are so many good modelers in narrow gauge. And I think, that's kind of why I was attracted to it, not necessarily because I was in any shape or form a good modeler, but because I wanted to be one. And I wanted to be working in a medium where other people could inspire me. And so that's kind of the way I went.
Yeah, Heath, let's see. No, Lynn McCurdy and HDMMRC said, have you met Jason Jensen, or have you seen his YouTube channel? Is probably the better.
I think I have, yeah. I've met a lot of guys either virtually or in person here in the narrow gauge scene here in Colorado. I mean, I give shout outs like, for example, Mike McCarville. He and I talk all the time, although I've never personally met the man. We've always either missed each other at shows or something, but he's been doing some amazing modeling. He's got a great YouTube channel. He's building some RGS stuff, some East Broadtop stuff. He's working with Bill Banta on some new projects and so on. I know Michelle, again, virtually from the Railroad Museum up in Greeley, the Model Railroad Museum. Some of the people I've met in person, some of the people I haven't. sometimes people will see me because they've seen my profile and I guess GMR or something, and they recognize, or from my YouTube channel because I show my face, which may be a big mistake. Maybe I'd have more followers if I didn't. But they'll recognize me at a show and be like, "Hey, how you doing?" And I always wondered if I brought them down to the basement, if they'd just be disappointed if they saw this in person. Because I think, like I said, I'm pretty good at photographing it to make it look better than it really is. There's things I'm good at and things I'm not good at. And at best, I can cover up the things I'm not good at.
Actually, I've heard that said that the art of fine bottle railroading is putting a bush on the thing that you need to cover up. The glue spot, the mistake you made. It is even Adam Savage, I follow his YouTube channel and watch his. Adam Savage basically says being a craftsman has figured out how to, fix your mistakes. That's the difference in a great bottle maker in his case, because that's ultimately what he does as well. There's so wide a range of inspirations you can have, but I assure you, I can see a wide swatch of your layout behind you, and it's quite spectacular. And
I'm looking to see where extra 455 is. Oh, okay. I see it. Sorry, I kind of lost track of my train there for a minute. But yeah, no, I hear you. And a good friend of mine also from back east, David K. Smith. He's a well-published N scale, Z scale guy. One of his favorite sayings is that weathering covers a host of sins. One of the beauties about modeling narrow gauge is you got to weather it. So you can cover up a lot of sins with weathering.
Yeah. Well, I see Ralph Rizzetti, our own mud father, who is my inspiration for weathering predominantly, had mentioned about narrow gaugers having been scratch built, which you were talking about briefly. But I'm assuming you do quite a bit of scratch building on your layout, and Ralph's asking you about that.
I do. I do a lot of kit bashing. I've done a lot of Craftsman kits, but there are times where scratch building is a necessity. And it's to me, it's just like I'm an avid recycler and I save things, right? So I've got stuff from kits I built when I was a teenager, that I just have parts lying around. So when it goes to scratch build, it's like this, sort of building a kit without instructions, really. And one of the beautiful things again about the RGS is there's so much information about it that like the RGS story books. I'm going to grab one real quick and show you what I mean. These books contain plans, and they're plans by Mike Blazik. And although the book doesn't have the dimensions in them, and I don't want to sell Mike Blazik short, because he actually will sell the plans with dimensions. Very often, though, I can cross-reference something else. I've got another book that shows that, it has the sort of the valuation stuff for the railroad that, at Lizard Head, the bunkhouse was 22 by 16 feet. Well, then I have Mike's plan without the dimensions, so I can kind of scale everything out, and I can scratch build that way. Or sometimes I'll just take a photograph, because sometimes close is good enough, right? If it's a structure that never really was photographed well, and it's sort of in the distance or wasn't measured by anyone, then you can really get away with just kind of making it look just sort of good enough. I do see a question down there about who are the modelers that inspire me. My gosh, I certainly did mention Malcolm Furlow, right? So I'm going to go to the other extreme now and talk about sort of the uber realistic stuff. In terms of narrow gauge, there's a couple guys out there: Craig Symington, Jeff Reynolds, Mark Evans, John Coker, and some other RGS guys, Bill Scobie, of course, that are doing super realistic work on modeling prototype narrow gauge. Lex Parker, he's another one. I'm inspired by a group of guys on the internet at a internet forum called the Railwire. So I mentioned Ed Kapuscinski. There's some other guys out there, David Smith, Tom Mann. I'm going to really trip over a lot of names here because I'm not going to remember them all right off the top of my head. But like Phil Hoffman, there's a couple guys out there who I really only know by their screen names, who are just amazing modelers and who I use as a sounding board. If I feel like I need to socialize something, they're the guys I go to. And the great thing about it is, we kind of all have set aside our egos to where we're willing to do the real critiquing. And, we always say that attaboys don't come cheap over there. We don't post pictures just to get, oh, that's great. I want to know, okay, what did I screw up here? Does that look, does this look right to you? And there's enough guys with some narrow gauge knowledge there, but in general, you just need some guys who can spot sort of the problem areas and correct. Dave Fox, for example, he's great for showing me if I have a kink in my track somewhere in a photograph. He's like, is that a kink I see? Yeah, it is, Dave. I'll go fix it. So, things like that. So we kind of say, sort of tongue in cheek, better modeling through peer pressure. And I really feel that's really upped my game. When I joined that group too, I felt like the little kid brother being invited to go out with the cool kids, and sort of hang with a crew that I didn't even feel like I was sort of like I deserved to be there. Let me put it that way. And so there's still a lot of great modeling going on there. I'm trying to think. There's some other YouTube channels that I watch. Oh, I don't want to miss this one here. I mentioned Malcolm Furlow, but there's somebody out there who's doing Malcolm better than Malcolm, and that's Dave Meek and his Thunder Mesa Studios.
Oh, wow. Yes, I've seen his work.
I think everybody's probably seen that. And you want to talk about somebody who has really hit the nail on the head in terms of his theme and how everything and every aspect of that layout ties in, the artistry, the design. Every time I watch his stuff, I have to fight the urge to sell off all my Blackstone and go into ON30. I really do.
Well, he's done so much in such a small space, and he's been so generous. And that's something that's so amazing about having the internet, is that we have the luxury of the generosity of communities. And in Dave's case with Mesa, whatever, that small layout he's
Under Mesa, yeah.
Yeah, I love that little layout. He shared so much about some of the styrofoam carving techniques and such that are just, I'm a styrofoam modeler as well. And it's really, regardless of whether you model anything close to what he's doing, his techniques of carving is really something.
I see one comment down there saying, did I know that Lex Parker's layout's coming down? And yeah, we kind of covered that earlier on. And sadly, I saw that on Facebook, and it took me a while to dig deep enough to find out why. And it just turns out the man is moving. But that is one of the flagship narrow gauge layouts out there. I have rarely seen, the DNR-GW done that well, and see it come down. I'm sad, but I totally get it. I've had this RGS is my 8th layout. I've had the Colorado Midland is my 9th layout, with the exception of the Pensy Juniata division, which I said I sold to a friend in California, Eric White. The rest of all ended up in dumpsters. Yeah. You learn some and you move on. So there's that. But in terms of one more model I wanted to throw out, because again, I'm going to not hit all of them because I'd be here all night. There's a guy out there working in HON30. His name is Chris Schmuck. And you might have seen some of his craftsman type stuff. He does a lot of 3D printed stuff, a lot of really cool kit bashes. You mentioned generosity, and he and David K. Smith are two people that I would throw out there as having sort of showing the epitome of the generosity of this hobby. Guys who would give you the shirt off their backs if it could help you through a project. So just, again, I know I'm missing a bunch of names, and I really hope that guys who are watching this aren't feeling left out, because there's no way I could, thank them all or mention them all. But I take inspiration from almost everything I see, to be perfectly honest. I don't think I ever look at photographs or YouTube videos of model railroads and not at least find some inspiration. I may not see something that I'm trying to model. I may see something that's completely antithetical to what I'm trying to model, but if there's a technique in there, or if somebody has captured a feel or a vibe or a prototype then I'm always inspired by that to sort of double down on my own efforts. And how can I make my RGS more RGS kind of thing,
Yeah. Well, there's so much crossover knowledge. One last layout question that I don't think we'd got to, since you talked about disposable. Since we've all built so many disposable layouts, I'm building mine in modules. I don't know about modules. Sectional. It's not meant to be portable, but it could be moved. It's not going to be easy, but it could be moved. Right. Have you built this in some detachable or sectionable fashion, or is it permanent and disposable whenever it needs to be moved?
Oh, so when I first started working on the RGS, it still wasn't clear that we'd be staying here in Colorado Springs. I had some. I was retiring off the faculty at the Air Force Academy, and I had some potential job prospects up in Boulder. But my kids were in high school, and so that was kind of like okay, what do we do now kind of thing. And so with the uncertainty, I built the benchwork here in sections. As it began to really look like we were staying put, so my wife was still on active duty when I retired. and then she ended up getting a civilian job at headquarters NORAD just down the road here at Peterson Air Force Base. Sorry, Peterson Space Force Base. I'm never going to get used to saying that. I kind of made the layout more permanent where the scenery started to blend over. You can see that the fascia, I don't know how you pronounce that word, is pretty much continuous. And so to move this layout would be possible, but it would be somewhat traumatic. I will tear it down. The brackets are bolted into the studs, and, they'll come out. I'll have to patch everything up. But, it's not like my previous layouts that were completely self-contained, boxed with handles and folding legs. This is much more like a permanent layout.
Yeah, and the funny thing is to hear people say permanent layout versus sectional. None of them are permanent. All of them are temporary to some degree. It's what is the length of time of that? What is the temporal time that we're talking about in temporary? Just how destructive is the process? That's the only question, is how destructive. Mine's not going to be perfect, but it will be movable.
Yeah, my Pensy layout actually turned out to be a lot less temporary than I thought. I ended up holding on to that probably longer than I should have, because it had gotten to the point where I spent a lot of time sort of stressing over how I could continue to improve it, how I could expand it, and so on. And all of my designs for future layouts tried to incorporate this very self-contained, very insular layout plan. And I probably missed out on some model railroading fun by holding on to that as long as I did.
I really question whether or not that's possible. I think focus does limit us in a whole lot of ways, but I found focus to be pretty rewarding for me to model a very specific thing. Rio Grande and Southern, or Rio Grande Southern, not Rio Grande Southern, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So interestingly, the Rio Grande Southern never ran anywhere near the Rio Grande River. It was only called such because it dropped south from the Denver and Rio Grande's narrow gauge transcontinental line that went through Montrose, Colorado. So that's, and he wanted to be associated with the very successful Denver and Rio Grande. So he called it the Rio Grande Southern. It could have been called just about anything, but never ran anywhere near the actual Rio Grande River. It was on the wrong side of the Continental Divide.
Let's see. We have any more questions? If not, we've run about an hour, folks. If you guys have any other quick questions, I think we've about run for an hour. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Dave.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And sorry about the technical issues. If you want to have me back when Bill's around, you just let me know. But I figured, hey, I was ready to go tonight, so I'm glad you were able to accommodate me. So.
Oh, absolutely. And I hate that it was such a little scatter. It was 5 minutes before 8 o'clock when they called me and asked if how that Bill had some issue, what I could do. And I'm like, yeah, just a second. When they hand me my food through the drive-through, I will be right home. So it just took me a minute to get here to take into account. I'm really glad that we did get a chance to. I just couldn't put your name together, but it took me a few minutes to remember where I'd seen your work so much before. I spent many years following your work for a long time. It's really incredible to have talked to you.
I appreciate it.
Guy.
I just would like to close with this. There's nothing unique at all about anything that I've done. And if it weren't for just the volumes that were published in Model Railroad or Railroad Model Craftsman and all the books and all that came before the internet. And of course, now with the internet having so many resources, whether it's YouTube or Facebook pages or model railroad forums and so on, that what I did wouldn't be possible. We use the expression, standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Anything I've been able to accomplish as a model railroader has been 100% basically made possible by other guys, things that they've learned and things that they've done. And most importantly, my father. And when people were asking about who my modeler inspirations were, what I didn't mention was the many hours I spent as a young kid watching my father scratch build models of various Reading depots and buildings from Eastern Pennsylvania, which is where our family's originally from, and probably killing brain cells with that ambroid glue and diasol, the fumes, right? But I would watch for hours while he would meticulously scratch build like a feed mill or something. And so my number one modeling inspiration has to be hands down my father. And he's in his early 80s now, and so I don't know if he's ever going to build a layout to completion. I keep offering to drop everything and go back east to help him build it if he finally decides to do that. But he's content to build models and put them in cases and look at them and so on. We had talked about building an HON3 layout when I was still in high school, and it didn't happen. But this really is the realization of what we used to talk about. In fact, I will throw one last thing out there. Right behind the laptop here, I have a brass precision scale model of Rio Grande Southern 10-wheeler number 25, sister engine of famous 20. And it was something my father bought in a hobby store in East Williston, Long Island, back in the early 1980s. And he didn't know what he had gotten in terms of, precision scale did 2 runs of these engines. One was a big run that had a really unreliable open can motor or open frame motor, was not a reliable runner. And they did a second, much more limited run that had a can motor and were some of the best runners ever made in narrow gauge brass. Well, he managed to get himself the good one without really knowing that. Well, so the years go by and it sits in a box and sits in a box, and I tell him, hey, I'm finally building that HON3 layout we talked about. And I had this thing, I sent it up to Craig Stewart at Narrow Gauge Colorado here in Denver, and we put Tsunami 2 system in it, painted it, weathered it. And unfortunately, due to COVID, he hasn't been out here since then, but we're trying to get him out here so that he can run his engine on the Rio Grande Southern, the layout we talked about building some 30, 40 years ago, so he can finally have that experience.
Wow, that comes full circle to get a chance to see that from 40 years ago, and that those locomotives were so incredibly rare.
Gosh, this thing runs as well as a Blackstone. You wouldn't believe that it's brass.
Wow. So I think Blackstone done something for narrow gauge, kind of like what Bachmann did for ON30.
Yep.
I have a tendency, if I was modeling an O, I'd probably model ON3, even at the additional cost, because I'm one of those persnickety kind of people that would want to do that. But boy, what Bachmann has done for ON30 and for the O narrow gauge, let's just say,
Yep.
and what Blackstone had done for HON3 that had brought people into HON3 would have never done HON3. There's no reason why it can't run good. A lot of this in-scale stuff is spectacular running. There's no reason narrow gauge can't run good. Just historically, HON3 stuff run about like 1 in 3 locomotives would run really well, and it would run in reverse at about 28 miles an hour only.
Yep.
And so Blackstone put the crazy stuff for us.
You bring in a good point. And as a former N scaler and as a current N scaler, I just want to remind folks who tend to sometimes dismiss N scale that N scale is every bit a modeler scale as any other scale. And the modern day equipment looks, sounds, and runs just as well in N as it does in HO. So I want to throw a pitch out there for my former primary scale and my side piece, N scale. It is just as much a modeler scale.
When I tried N scale, 25 years ago when I was in the military, 25 years ago when I was in the military, and it was kind of on the end of that bad running period of N scale's development. It was starting to get okay, but I had run on Stephen Atwell's layout, the gentleman who owns Midwest Model Railroad at one of the conventions.
Right.
And operated that little layout for a while in scale, and it ran like a Swiss watch. It was as good as you could ever ask for an HO locomotive to run, from slow speed performance, coupling and uncoupling. I thought I wouldn't do in scale at all because I like operating. There's no reason in the world that you can't operate in scale as long as your eyesight's adequate. That's going to be the only difference.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. Eyesight and motor control are important bits in N scale, but I've done some operations on N scale layouts that have been every bit as complicated and as involved and as reliable. I did a yardmaster job on Eric Payne's big layout back when that was still a thing, and on John Berger's Maryland and Ohio, and those things operate, with the same jobs that you would have for a big HO layout, and just as reliably. A lot of it really comes down to track work.
Yes.
Because no scale is immune to bad track work. Let's be honest, right? Good track work is good track work in any scale. And, there are some manufacturers that just make great products. Anything by Cato or Cato, that's always a running joke. How do you pronounce it? Is it Cato or is it Cato? And some of the other producers making some amazing, even Bachmann has had a couple home runs. I mean, they've had a couple strikeouts too with some of their mechs, but they've had a couple really good running engines as well. And the fact that N-scale steam is now a thing. It's no longer, something to sit on a shelf or park in a yard, that you can do N-scale steam with sound and have it operate as well as diesels. That's just, that's just good stuff. And I'm really hoping to see more of that, even though I'm not really doing much in N scale beyond my little niche 1905 thing. I'm definitely a big cheerleader for the scale.
Absolutely. If you spent that much time with it, that layout was really incredible. We didn't talk too much about that, but how much you could pack in a 36 by 80, right? A door platform.
Yeah, it was a 36-inch wide hollow core door. Yep.
Yep. And I've said to many people, you could go buy a door for $30 or something. You have framework. If you don't want to build a framework, if you don't want to be a carpenter, you don't have to be. It helps. And as the layout grows in complexity, carpentry skills and carpentry tools are going to be, I find it a really enjoyable part. I really like the woodworking and the bench work, but some don't. But if you want to build a small layout, a hollow core door is a working layout in a matter of a few minutes.
I won't lie, the Juniata division did start to sag a little bit toward the end between North Carolina, Florida, Nebraska, Colorado. The different climates weren't especially kind to it, and I thought I had sealed it adequately, but maybe I hadn't. I did tend to it was starting to sag a little bit to where I'd park a car on a siding, and the side car would just kind of do a little one of these and so on. So, yeah, it wasn't anything that affected train operation, but I would notice it if I parked a car on a siding.
But that's a lot of years. I mean, I seen that layout a long time ago.
Oh, yeah. I think I built it. So as a PhD student at North Carolina State, when I started building that in 2006, 2005, I think. 2005? Yeah. Yeah, it was 2005 when I did that.
Yeah, that was something. It was really something. Well, I really appreciate you saying that about the building on the shoulders of giants. The one thing I'd add to that for sure is if we could not model after all these other modelers, if we had to invent everything, if we had to experiment and try everything, we would need a much more time than any of us have to commit to this hobby. But speaking of time, I really appreciate you sharing an hour of your life with us tonight and putting up with me, not being as prepared to jump in as Bill is. He's more on this.
No, you did great. You did great. No, and for me, I just enjoy sharing my love of the hobby. I love the prototype I've chosen. I love the hobby. I love everything about this hobby, with maybe the exception of some of the stereotypical people you might meet at a train show. But for the most part, yeah, I just love sharing my love of the hobby. So it's been my pleasure.
But every hobby would have a few Walmart types and such. But you've been on the upper end of this hobby.
Model railroading is not alone in that respect. Nope.
But it takes a few of the layouts before. But all three of the layouts that I've seen of yours have all been enough for me to have remembered from quite a few years ago that I seen your in-scale layout. That was a few layouts ago. So, but thanks so much for hanging with me for an hour tonight. Thanks everybody for jumping in and putting up with me as well. And I'm glad that we got a chance to share Dave with you because he is one heck of a modeler if you hadn't seen him before, but I bet you have, as I had as well. If you'll check the Facebook for the next upcoming show, I'm not sure if Johnny's on tomorrow night or if it is next week, but we'll post that on Facebook. I have a hard time remembering. It's every other
I sent Big Bill the links to my 2 Facebook pages for model railroading. By the way, I don't share model train stuff on my personal Facebook page. So if you want to personally Facebook friend me, you're not going to see train stuff. But I shared those with Big Bill, so I don't know how that ends up working. But you can just easily search for my stuff out there on Facebook, and you'll find my pages both for my RGS and for my Colorado Midland, plus the YouTube channel.
And we'll get that. I'll get those from Bill. We'll get them posted in the description. So look in the doobly-doo below this video, and you'll find Dave's stuff, and you can follow him as I have for many years.
All right.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Dave.
it. Thank you. Here, guys.